Hi guys. Okay, SSH tunneling. Very important concept, and you need to be able to do this almost without thought if you're starting to develop in the microservices type environment. Okay, so what we'll learn is we'll learn to create a basic tunnel to an HTTP service running on a remote server. Remember, this is pre-set up for you. I'm not going to go through how you set these up. It's highly secure. Okay, and access to this will be through a bash terminal, Linux or WSL or similar. In other words, it'll work on a bash on a Mac machine, right? You need to have SSH access to that server with key pairs. Why with key pairs? Well, it just stops you from having to enter in passwords all the time, on top of which entering passwords is a security risk. So we've set up key pairs that make sure that we've got non-repudiation. In other words, only those people that are supposed to be in the tunnel are in the tunnel, and that have been set up by a DevOps engineer, i.e. me. Okay? And you need to have a localhost set up on that server that you're trying to access with some or other site. Right. So, what's the setup for this tutorial? I have a Linux-based terminal, access to the protected Bastion server through public IP only, using SSH key pairs. Highly secure. Anything that I access within the remote network is now secure. I have a GitLab Community Edition service running on localhost at and on the standard port 80, and this is not publicly exposed to the internet. So let's picture it. Right. Here's the workstation, me sitting on desktop, access to the internet. Right. And so we have a remote server, right, with a Bastion server, this representing the Bastion server, an HTTP environment with GitLabs running on it, on that server, but this is essentially gapped from the internet because this server has got no GUI, and I have not specifically not enabled internet access for this HTTP environment because I want only people with the correct level of access to be able to access this. Okay? Right, and we're going to create an SSH only tunnel. So this is our only way of getting hold of this environment. This is not an optional route. So the internet is not an optional route. You cannot sit here and type in some other address, and that address will automatically pop up and give you the server. No, we want to SSH tunnel it only. That way we can keep it secure. Right, so the first thing we're going to do is we change directory in our bash to the SSH environment. A couple of important files here. First of all, there is the RSA ID, right, which is my private key. Okay, there's the public key, which, by the way, I've copied to the server, right? So the server will know, given that private key, checking it against that public key, yes, this user has got access to the environment. Obviously, I can remove these keys, right, for people that I don't want to be in there, and I can add new keys for people that I do want to be in there. That's the DevOps function. Secondly, there's a very important file here called config, and we're going to use config to actually set up something. So if we edit the config, we're just using nano, so that's the command nano config. All right, we are now able to set up a host pseudonym called demo. It'll access this IP address. This is an IP address as user Wayne on the server at that IP address. So not that important for this thing, but we've set up the environment in such a way that anybody hitting the public IP address on port 22, which is the SSH port, will automatically be directed only to the to the Bastion server, and only if they have the correct level of access will they be granted access according to the private key, which is checked against the public key. Right. So to access this, all I type in now is SSH demo. Why? Because I've set up a demo sudo in my config file to access it, and access will be automatic. There'll be no asking for a password or anything like that, simply because we're using keys to authenticate against. And as you can see at the bottom of the screen, I'm now in the Bastion server, right, remotely. Okay. Now, that's great. All right. We've now created an SSH connection. But how do we tunnel this? Very simply, we say, again, we do SSH demo, but we now add to that. And we say, by the way, we want a local tunnel, right, on port 8085, which must be, that's the separator between what we want and what there is remotely, localhost, right? In other words, 127.0.0.1, port 80, because that's where the GitLab environment is running. So if we enter this one line, we've now got a tunnel. So we've created the tunnel. And that being the case, it means we can now go into our internet browser, whichever one it is. We can now access localhost on, not that port, but 8085, right? And we've actually seen the GitLab environment. Okay, good. So, important thing here is don't leave the tunnel active. If you finished using the tunnel, simply log out. It'll hesitate like that, all right? But leave the tunnel out. Okay, so you type in exit, it'll be a logout. You can then terminate the screen and you finished using the tunnel, which is important because you must leave the tunnel up while you're trying to use it. It doesn't know about the tunnel unless you've got that SSH session running. Okay, so let's summarize. What's the result over here? That being our environment as it is set up, right? We've got the route to an SSH tunnel now, so we can come in this way and not that way, right? That being publicly accessible, this being extremely privately accessible, and we now have our GitLab's HTTP environment operating without a GUI or without any internet access on the Bastion server, right? We've tunneled that through using SSH tunneling, and we can see that in our browser. Thank you. That's it.